We will take this. No matter what it costs, we will take this. These are Donald Trump's words about Greenland. An announcement dismissed by the media as the ramblings of an old man, mocked by late-night shows, was in fact the opening phase of the most aggressive foreign policy move of the 21st century. Because while comedians were laughing, Beijing and Moscow were not reacting the same way. Putin's statement was clear. This is no surprise. America's interest in Greenland is a century-old geopolitical necessity. And right here is where the reality everyone missed begins. This is not a golf course project. This is about controlling the new great trade route, dominating the rare earth elements market, and the survival of American hegemony in the Northern Hemisphere. The video you are watching right now will expose the truth the mainstream media is not telling you. Let me tell you something first. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, press the subscribe button now, because in the coming months this issue will explode, and you will witness the truth here first. In recent weeks, America's rhetoric has shifted from buying to securing. Verified reports coming from inside the Pentagon say that the purchase of Greenland is no longer being launched as a business deal, but as a national security necessity. The Vice President has made unprecedented visits to the region. Warnings directed at Denmark have hardened. The message is crystal clear. America can no longer tolerate a passive European landlord managing the most strategic real estate in North America. The media calls this a gaffe. History calls it the Monroe Doctrine. But to understand the future, we first need to excavate the past. This story did not begin with Trump. It began in the 19th century. The white whale American foreign policy has chased for 150 years is Greenland. In 1867, when Secretary of State William Seward bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, everyone mocked him. They called it Seward's Folly, a frozen wasteland. Today, considering Alaska's economic output and its strategic position against Russia, that $7.2 million looks like one of the greatest investments in financial history. But Seward didn't want only Alaska. In his 1868 report, he explicitly described Greenland as the next necessary step to encircle the North American continent. He saw what few others did. Greenland is the gatekeeper of the Atlantic. The idea slept, but it never died. In 1910, the American ambassador proposed a complex three-way swap. In 1946, President Truman put $100 million in gold on the table. The Danes rejected the sale, but they accepted something far more important. They allowed America to stay. The 1951 Defense Agreement effectively turned Greenland into an American military protectorate. Thule Air Base was established, the northernmost U.S. military installation in the world. For decades, Thule was the only thing standing between American cities and Soviet nuclear annihilation. It hosted early warning radar systems designed to detect Soviet bomber aircraft. So why the panic now? Why has Trump's rhetoric escalated to the threat of unilateral action? Because the status quo is collapsing. The ice is melting and sharks are circling. The comfortable arrangement, where Denmark holds the deed and America holds the guns, is no longer sufficient for Washington. To understand this, we need to examine the three pillars of the new Arctic crisis. the sovereignty trap, the red dragon, and the rare earth monopoly. Let's start with political reality. Greenland is not a state. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Vast, 2.1 million square kilometers, 3 times the size of Texas, but with fewer than 57,000 people. In the capital, Nuuk, a growing independence movement has been gaining momentum for decades. The 2008 referendum granted Greenland significant autonomy, control over its police, courts, and natural resources. But it has an Achilles heel: money. The Greenlandic economy is fundamentally dependent on a block grant from Denmark. Every year, Copenhagen sends roughly $600 million to Nuuk. This subsidy covers more than half of the government's budget. Without this Danish cash, schools would close, hospitals would stop, and public services would collapse. That $600 million is the price of Danish sovereignty, the leash that keeps Greenland tied to Europe. This is where Trump's strategy becomes Machiavellian. The White House ran the numbers. $600 million a year is a rounding error for the United States, less than the cost of half a B-2 bomber. The strategy formulated in the Situation Room is simple: outspend the Danes. If the U.S. were to offer, say, a $2 billion annual direct aid package plus direct infrastructure investment, it could bypass Denmark entirely and buy the loyalty of the Greenlandic government. The goal is to use the brute force of the U.S. Treasury to drive a wedge between Nuuk and Copenhagen. But why pay anything at all? Why would America care about a frozen candidate in 2026? Because China is at the door. This brings us to the most critical element of modern geopolitical analysis: China's Arctic incursion. While Western media focused on Trump's tweets, the Chinese Communist Party was conducting a silent occupation of the Arctic. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, a term with no geographic basis, but plenty of economic ambition. Beijing is 800 miles from the Arctic Circle. In 2018, China officially incorporated the Arctic into the Belt and Road Initiative, calling it the Polar Silk Road. The moment that woke up the Pentagon occurred in 2016. A Chinese company, General Nice, attempted to purchase an abandoned naval base in Greenland. Think about that for a second. A Chinese firm ultimately accountable to the CCP trying to acquire a deep-water port in America's backyard. Under intense pressure from Washington, the Danish government vetoed the deal. But the Chinese didn't retreat, they pivoted. In 2017, the Prime Minister of Greenland was invited to Beijing. Red carpets were rolled out. They talked about importing Greenlandic seafood, seemingly harmless, but the delegation included construction firms and state-owned banks. They proposed a massive project. China would build and finance 3 new international airports in Greenland. This was the debt trap model applied to the Arctic. The cost of these airports ran into hundreds of millions of dollars, an enormous share of Greenland's GDP. If Greenland defaulted, China would effectively own critical infrastructure, controlling North Atlantic airspace. When then U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis heard about this, he told his Danish counterpart that the United States would not allow China to lay runways in the Arctic. The U.S. forced Denmark to co-finance the airports to push the Chinese out. But it was a near miss, and it revealed a terrifying truth to American planners. Denmark is too weak to hold the line. Copenhagen lacks the financial muscle and strategic will to counter a rising China. If the U.S. does not step in and take direct control, Greenland will eventually fall into Beijing's economic orbit, because China is willing to write the checks Denmark will not. But China's interest isn't just about airports or shipping lanes. It's about what lies beneath the ice. And this is where the numbers become staggering. We are on the edge of a green transition. The entire global economy is shifting from hydrocarbons to electrification, from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, wind turbines, and advanced fighter jet. All of these technologies require one thing: rare earth element, neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, the vitamins of modern industry. You cannot build an F-35 without them. You cannot build a Tesla without them. Right now, China controls roughly 80 to 90% of global rare earth processing. They have a chokehold on the American supply chain. If Beijing decides to cut exports, the U.S. defense industry grinds to a halt. Greenland is the solution. Geologists believe Greenland holds one of the largest undeveloped rare earth deposits on the planet. The Kvanefjeld mine alone is thought to contain around 100 million tons of ore, enough to meet global demand for decades. And it's not just rare earths. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that Greenland's offshore regions contain 17.5 billion barrels of undiscovered oil and 148 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Let's put a price tag on that. One study estimates the market value of Greenland's accessible minerals at roughly $200 billion. When oil, gas, and minerals are combined, the total estimated value could reach $4 trillion. Against these numbers, Denmark's $600 million subsidy looks pathetic. That's why Trump views this as a purchase. From an empire economics perspective, buying Greenland is like buying Amazon stock in 1997. A low-value asset today because it's covered in ice, but that ice is melting. And melting ice brings us to the third reason for urgency: shipping routes. Climate change is reshaping global trade map. As polar ice retreats, two new shipping routes are opening: the Northwest Passage through Canada and Greenland, and the Northern Sea route through Russia. These are the Suez Canals of the 21st century. Using the northern route cuts the shipping distance between Shanghai and Hamburg by nearly 40% compared to the traditional Suez route, thousands of miles, weeks of travel time, and millions of dollars in fuel savings. It bypasses Somali pirate waters and Middle Eastern choke points. Whoever controls Greenland controls the eastern gate of the Northwest Passage. If America owns Greenland, the Arctic Ocean effectively becomes an American lake. If China or Russia gains a foothold, the Arctic becomes a contested war zone. Russia is already moving. Vladimir Putin has militarized the Arctic at a pace that has shocked NATO. Russia has refurbished dozens of Soviet-era bases, deployed S-400 missile systems, and built a fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers that dwarfs the American fleet. Russia treats the Northern Sea route as internal waters, charging transit fees and requiring foreign ships to take Russian pilots. In this context, Greenland is the unsinkable aircraft carrier the U.S. needs to project power against Russia. Trump's threats of military force are a signal not just to Copenhagen, but to Moscow, a declaration that the Monroe Doctrine extends to the Arctic. So how does this actually happen? How does a modern democracy buy or take territory in the 2020s? The media portrays it as a transaction, a check written from one president to another. But the reality, as we analyze here at Econ Empires, is far more complex and likely involves coercion and destabilization strategies. America cannot invade Greenland without shattering NATO. Denmark is a NATO ally. You can't bomb a friend, but you can make them an offer they can't refuse, and make their current position untenable. What's emerging, hinted at in NBC interviews and recent congressional hearings, is a two-pronged pressure campaign. The first prong, economic seduction of the Greenlandic people. The U.S. is opening a consulate in Nuuk. That's step one. The State Department is bypassing Copenhagen and engaging directly with local politicians. The message to Greenlanders is simple. Denmark is holding you back. They see you as a charity case. We will see you as partners. If the U.S. offers a compact of free association, similar to those with Palau or the Marshall Islands, Greenland could become nominally independent but practically a U.S. protectorate. The U.S. would take over defense and foreign policy, block China, and in return, every Greenlandic citizen would gain a U.S. passport and access to the American economy. The $600 million Danish subsidy would be replaced with American investment in mining and tourism. For a population of 56,000, the influx of American capital would make them one of the richest per capita societies on Earth almost overnight. It would be a sort of attraction that Denmark could not match. The second prong, geopolitical squeezing of Denmark. Simultaneously, the U.S. is applying massive pressure on Denmark. Behind closed doors, the message is that Denmark is failing its NATO obligations by underinvesting in Arctic defense, leaving the alliance's back door open. If Denmark wants to keep Greenland, it must militarize it. By American jets, American radar, and American ships to patrol the waters. This is a trap. Denmark is a small welfare state. It cannot afford a massive Arctic military buildup. The cost of defending Greenland against Russian and Chinese threats would bankrupt the Danish social model. The U.S. is betting that Danish taxpayers will eventually look at the cost and say, "It's not worth it. Let the Americans take it." This is a hostile takeover applied to a sovereign nation in corporate terms. You make the assets so expensive to hold that the owner is forced to sell. But there is a darker timeline. The rhetoric of unilateralism and not ruling out military options points to a scenario where legal niceties are ignored. If intelligence shows China covertly building dual-use facilities in Greenland, or Russia moving to deploy hypersonic missiles there, America would likely invoke national security and occupy the island. This would not be unprecedented. During World War II, when Nazi Germany occupied Denmark, the U.S. effectively took over Greenland to prevent it from falling into German hands. The legal argument was that the Danish government in Copenhagen was compromised and unable to exercise sovereignty. Today's argument would be that the Danish government is too weak to exercise sovereignty in the face of Chinese economic aggression. The Trump doctrine is this: sovereignty is not a right, it is a responsibility. If you cannot defend your territory, you do not own it. Preparations for this are already visible in the federal budget. The Office of Management and Budget has been tasked with calculating absorption costs, how to integrate Greenland's social security system, how to transition its currency from the Danish krone to the US dollar, and how to align its regulations with federal law. This is not a drill. This is bureaucratic preparation for annexation. We also have to consider American domestic politics. Why does this resonate with American voters? It taps into manifest destiny. For a country that feels it has lost ground globally, manufacturing to China, influence in the Middle East, acquiring Greenland represents a return to expansion. It's tangible. It changes the map. It adds a resource-rich 51st state or territory. Look at the timeline. Reports from recent weeks show acceleration. Ice is melting faster than expected. Chinese icebreakers are launching faster than expected. The window of opportunity is closing. If the U.S. waits another decade, Greenland may be so economically entangled with China that disentangling it without war will be impossible. Act now and you get a diplomatic crisis with Europe. Act later and you get a kinetic conflict with China. The Vice President's recent visit to Thule Air Base was not a photo op, it was a site inspection. The harsh criticism of Denmark for underinvesting in security was the opening salvo of negotiations. Trump's offer is likely already in draft form. So what happens next? Expect a referendum in Greenland within the next few years, likely framed as a vote for full independence from Denmark. The U.S. will openly or covertly fund the independence campaign. When Greenland declares independence, it will immediately sign a defense and economic pact with the United States, becoming a U.S. territory in all but name. Denmark will protest. The European Union will issue strongly worded letters. But in a hard power world, Europe has no cards to play. They rely on the U.S. military for protection against Russia. They will not risk alienating Washington over a frozen island that costs money to maintain. In conclusion, the joke about buying Greenland is the most serious geopolitical maneuver of our time, a convergence of climate change, resource scarcity, and great power competition. The U.S. sees a future where the Arctic becomes the Mediterranean of the 21st century, the center of trade and conflict. In that world, Greenland is Gibraltar, the fortress that controls the realm. Love him or hate him, Donald Trump operates on a transactional logic that views nations as assets and liabilities. To him, Greenland is a distressed asset with massive upside potential, currently mismanaged by a negligent owner. The hostile takeover is already in motion. Lawyers are drafting documents, geologists are surveying mines, and generals are updating maps. We are witnessing the expansion of American borders in real time. The question is not if, it's when. And when it happens, remember where you heard the logic first. This was never about ego. It was about the rare earths in your phone, the shipping routes for your goods, and the radar watching the skies. the law of the jungle, or in this case, the law of the ice. If this video added value for you, click the like button now and write your thoughts in the comment. If you want to understand real geopolitics, behind-the-scenes economics, and the true cost of power, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Be sure to check out my other in-depth videos because the world is changing and you need to be prepared. See you in the next video.